Hey, this is Gary of Backus Creative Imaging, and in this video I thought I'd show how to set up the Panasonic GH5 II camera for talking head videos on YouTube with autofocus, and kind of cover some of those settings that you would need to know to go and get up and running with this camera. So let's go and get started. Alright, so this camera has dual card slots, and it does support UHS 2 cards, but I use the cheap UHS 1 cards, which support basically every single recording mode except for the 4K all-eye mode, which I do not need. So let's go and go to the menu here. You press the menu/set button, and you can navigate the menu here by using the scroll wheel. You can also use the arrow keys to go into menus and navigate as well, like that. Let's just go to the wrench icon. By the way, you can also use the touch screen to navigate the menu. But let's go to the wrench icon, go all the way down to the memory card slot here. You can use the memory card icon. You can format your memory cards or erase them by using this option. So you can format card slot 1 and 2. The double card slot function is important to know. So there are 3 modes: backup recording, writes videos and photos to both cards at the same time. Relay recording will write content to one card, and then when it fills up, it'll write it to the next card. So even when it's writing to the second card, you could open up this bay door while it's recording video and hot swap that card with a fresh card. So that's in relay recording. And finally, there's allocation recording, where it records videos to one card and photo to the other. But I use it in backup recording, so that's what I do. Okay, so now I want to cover some quirks about the way the viewfinder and the screen works. So by default, and don't mind that little flashing dot, that's just being displayed on the video here. You can't see it in real life, so you can't see that. It's just on the video. So the screen by default is on, and there's a sensor here, and if you put your finger over it, it'll activate the viewfinder. However, this button right here toggles that functionality. There's 3 modes. There's this mode right here where it will automatically switch between those 2 viewing modes, right? Viewfinder or screen, based on the sensor. You can press the LVF button and it'll just do the viewfinder now. And if you do that, nothing happens, or it'll be on the screen only. Now I prefer this mode because if I want to use the viewfinder, I like to just flip the screen away and see the viewfinder. But again, if you're encountering some weird behavior, just press this button LVF and toggle between the 3 options. That's option 1, here's viewfinder, or I'm sorry, electronic viewfinder only, and here's the screen only. Okay, so now let's go into the camera settings. Let's go to menu set. The most important setting for video, and we are currently on the video mode of the exposure dial here, the command dial, right? Video mode. So this is exposure mode. So when it comes to your exposure modes, you have program, aperture, shutter, and manual. Now, for a talking head video for YouTube, especially indoors, I would just recommend using the shutter priority mode. And then you can also learn about what these do. Photography tutorials are out there where they describe they describe the difference between program, aperture, and shutter and manual. And while they tend to be for photography, it does relate to video, but just set it to shutter priority, especially if you're going to be doing some indoor video. If you're going to be doing outdoor video and you're not going to be using an ND filter, then just use aperture priority, maybe, but it's not absolutely necessary. But I would just recommend aperture priority for outdoor video without an ND filter, and which is what most people do, and then shutter priority for indoor video in lower light situations. So for your shutter speed, you're going to use, if you're shooting with 30 frames per second, then your shutter speed should be ideally you want it to be about twice your frame rate. So if you're 30 FPS, your shutter speed should be about 1/60th of a second. And to control that shutter speed, use this dial here. So you can see that as I'm moving the dial, I am controlling that shutter speed. And notice how the ISO is in auto, and it's gonna automatically change. So just set it to about 1/160th of a second. It doesn't show the fraction, but it is 1/160th. It's 1/60th of a second. And then the aperture will be as wide open as it can be to let in the most light. So this will give you a good quality video in low light. Now, if you're finding that if it feels too dark, if the picture looks too dark or too bright, you can enable the histogram. So this would be a way to view your video with this. This is called a histogram, and it'll show area if it's it'll show like how things are looking. So all the information. This is your highlights at the top, and on the left over here is your darks. So the shadows are on the left and the highlights on the right. Exposure value or exposure compensation is accessed with this button. So you press it, and what it's going to do is if you use this dial right here on the front, this dial right by the EV, you can control the exposure value. And what it's doing is when you change that setting, it's controlling the settings of the camera based on the metering mode. So right now, if I do this and I lower that exposure by 1 stop or -1 EV, it's going to lower the settings of the camera to get exposure that is 1 stop less than what it thinks is the right exposure. You don't have to worry about what stops are right now, but it's basically going to be 1/2 the amount of light coming in. So anyways, let's go back to 0 EV. And this, even though it looks bright on the screen here on the recording, it actually looks just fine on this. But I'm going to bring the histogram back up. There it is. There's also a waveform monitor and plenty of other advanced monitoring tools on this camera. But if you're just trying to keep it simple, you could use the histogram as kind of a guide to make sure the video looks good. If things are looking like they're fitting within this box very well, then the exposure is good. But if, say, the box looked like that, where so much information's in the darker area and you don't really see anything in the lighter, then this would be considered an underexposed image. But as long as you keep your EV at about 0, generally speaking, your video will look fine. But if you want to darken a little bit, if you find that maybe your face is too bright in some videos or something, or whatever you're doing, depending on your background and stuff, if your background is really dark or something, you can always change this and tweak your exposure value, and then it'll change the settings in the camera, but your shutter speed will remain at 1/60th of a second. That is in shutter priority. That basically means that you are changing the shutter speed, you are setting it, and the camera is doing the other settings. And then aperture priority would be where you set the aperture, and instead of this dial doing shutter, it'll now do aperture for you. And then it'll affect the shutter speed and the ISO. The camera will affect those 2 other settings. However, again, for interior video, I recommend shutter speed or shutter priority for exposure mode. And for outdoor video, if you're not going to be using an ND filter, which is what most people do, aperture priority would be fine. So yeah, shutter priority for indoor videos is fine. Now, your photo style is like how the video looks. So there's standard, right? I'm going to go and focus on that, and I'll talk about that more later. There's standard, vivid, natural, and each of these you can adjust the contrast and things like that. You can go all the way down to sharpness and noise reduction, but we'll leave them alone for now. There's also, if you're trying to do talking head stuff, portrait might be the way to go for that, I think. If you don't want to do any color grading, you just want to have this and just get straight out of camera, good looking video, I think portrait would be pretty good to try out. And there's other modes as well, but we're going to go back to the standard one. So you got to set your photo style. That's kind of how your video is going to look. We're going to skip some of these settings because these are not too important. Now, synchro scan, if you've got lights, if you're filming indoors and you notice a flickering on the video, synchro scan will let you dial in a precise shutter speed so that the flickering, you can match the flickering of the lights, and therefore the flickering will go away. But for now, we'll leave that off. Let's see, let's keep going down here. We'll leave all of this alone because these are a bit more advanced. Let's go to the this is a very important page here. So record file format, MP4 and MOV. MP4 gives you the lower end recording options in the camera, while MOV gives you the higher recording options. Let's start with MP4. Let's go with record quality. Now, there's a lot of options in here, but actually there's not as many options. If you're in MOV, right, and you go to record quality, there's 6 pages of options, and these are really more high-end recording modes, right? But we're going to go back to MP4, and we're going to go to our record quality, and you can see there's only 2 pages here. There's some 4K options, and there's some 1080p options. If you just want to get some talking head shots in 1080p at 30 frames per second, decent quality, not too big of a file size, you can upload this to YouTube, no problem. There you go. That's 30 FPS. That's pretty good. If you want to do 60 frames per second, give your video a bit more of a smoother look, then you can go with the 60 frames per second. But we're going to do full HD 8-bit, 20 megabits a second, 30 frames per second progressive scan video. There we go. That'll look very good for YouTube. People are going to watch this on their phone anyway, so it doesn't really matter that much, and we could stay in MP4. Now, we're not going to get too much more advanced into this. Let's go and start talking about autofocusing. So This camera has an autofocusing switch right here. So this is single autofocus, continuous, and manual focus. For a talking head video, you want to be in continuous autofocus. Now, these are your autofocus settings here. If you press this button, you get some different AF modes. And by the way, you can remove some of these from this menu if you wanted to, but by default, they of course all appear here. So the one that I find that would be good for most people in general would be the one area. Now, by default, it does not detect human eyes or anything. Notice that little button there. It says Human Animal AF. If you press it with the touch screen, it'll say Human Detection is now on. Now Human and Animal Detect is on. If you press it again, it just goes to one area. So it'll just detect in that little box there. It'll detect what it. I mean, it'll try to it'll try to detect contrast and focus on that. So if I hit record, right, it's going to attempt to detect and focus and get some, whatever it finds that's contrasty, it'll go ahead and focus. But what it'll do is it'll display a box over the human subject. So just turn the camera towards you. And now when you hit record, it'll actually, as long as your face is somewhere within that box, it will then show a crosshair over your eye and your face. Now, if you want to make that recording, that focusing area bigger, because this is the area it's detecting contrast into focus, press this button again, the AF area. By the way, you can change these settings with the arrow. See that arrow, Human Animal Detect? You can have one area only, one area with human detection only, one area with human and animal detection. I'm using the up arrow, see? So you can either use the touch screen or the up arrow. AF area, again, I can either press it or I can press down. That's the little box. You can actually make the box bigger by dragging it, or you can use the wheel. You can even press the display button to reset the box to its default position or in size. So let's go and make it big. And now it will have no issue detecting a face as long as your face is in that frame, and it will autofocus on you. The next thing you might want to worry about is white balance. So white balance is like the lighting. It will match the lighting that you're in. So if you're in an interior scene, you might want to set it to the little house icon, or the lighting. This is like the incandescent lighting. You can also set your white balance to match the lights. So if you have older lights, these let's say you have tungsten lights, you might want to go to around 3500. But it depends on your lighting. Just turn this dial up, move it up to get the color matching quite well. Or you can use one of these presets here. One of these presets like this one right here, or auto white balance warm, auto white balance cool, or just auto white balance. Auto white balance would probably be just fine, honestly. So you don't really have to worry about that too much. And then as for, let's go and get our settings honed in, because right now these settings are absolutely horrible for what we're doing, because right now our shutter speed is way too high and our ISO is compensating, and it's really high. So let's go and get our settings more correct. So what we're going to do is let's go and make sure we're in shutter priority, right? Now when you're in shutter priority, you can use this dial to adjust your shutter speed. So if we're recording at 30 frames per second, it would be very pleasant to get a video at about 1/60th of a second shutter speed. That'll give you the 180-degree shutter angle rule. Now you don't have to have a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second at 30 frames per second, but it will produce some very pleasant motion blur, and it will look quite good. So if you feel it's too bright, you can go ahead and press this button right here, which is exposure compensation, and you can tone down that brightness so that it's not too bright. See? So you can go and do that. And then the ISO is going to be auto. We've got autofocus on right now, so we're ready to record a talking headshot. So I'm recording this talking headshot with the portrait photo style, and you can see it looks pretty good. Autofocus works very well on this camera for talking heads. On the GH5 it didn't work so well, but on this camera it's actually very good. Okay, so now let's go and cover some of the audio options in this camera. You can see there's quite a lot of audio options. The internal microphones are okay on this camera, but usually people want to mount a proper microphone on top. So there's plenty of options out there. They range from anywhere from $50 for a decent one to hundreds of dollars for a high-end one, but you don't need anything super high-end, just a cheap one that can go on top of this camera. And here are your audio options. If I press the menu set button, we go to the video icon here, and the audio options, there's quite a lot. You can, of course, display. I would recommend, if you want to display the audio levels, there they are. So if you say testing, 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 you see how loud that is? It's going into the red zone. You can go ahead and lower this down to something like maybe this. But actually what I do is go to low, and then now we can go to maybe 0. Okay, so you can say testing, testing, testing. That's not too bad. And you can have the sound record limiter on, which will tone down. If you're too loud, it'll tone it down so it doesn't like clip the audio. So honestly, something like this might be pretty decent for some talking head stuff. So something like that would be pretty good, but it depends on how far away you are from the camera and things like that. So just experiment with where you like to be. You can turn this up, but if you do attach a microphone, you would definitely want this sound record gain level to be on low, and then you can go and attach the microphone, and then the camera, you can still adjust this, you know, volume here in the camera, and of course adjust the microphone. But that's really the very, very up and running basics of audio. There's a whole lot more to it, but that'll just kind of get you going. So that's really about it for the raw basics of how to get this camera up and running for some talking head stuff. You can put it on a tripod, put a microphone on top, make sure the memory card slot function is set up the way you like, and of course you can record in 1080p video and it would look very good. Of course, if you wanted to do 4K as well, that's an option, but most people watch this stuff on their phone anyway, so 1080p is just fine. And that's really about it, and I hope this helped. And so if anybody has any other questions, feel free to ask, and I'll try to do more videos. So thanks for watching.